Hello, in this video I want to continue the series that I've been doing and actually kind of like finish it out with this final video with doing the series that we've been kind of discussing with Baudrillard and the relationship between a lot of Baudrillard's work and space privatization. I really think that having like a series that's focused on a more postmodern kind of like perspective for the resolution is really important, in being able to develop like a really holistic analysis of like where all the kind of like critical fields can develop. Obviously Baudrillard doesn't like fit in terms of being able to encompass every type of like form of postmodernism or every form of postmodern writing, but I do think it's a really interesting example of the way in which some of the concepts and like core theories or kind of like questions that are being asked for the resolution come up again in some of the conversations that are really being had in these literature bases and their interpretations of them. And in this video I kind of want to finish out the series by finishing the two-part videos that I started last time, talking about how critical teams can better respond to Baudrillard and when it's read as a negative criticism against critical affirmatives. I definitely have talked about in the past videos about like why Baudrillard is particularly oppressing criticism for certain apps that are really trying to figure out a direction for making futurism arguments work, and I want to continue to be able to kind of like think about what tools we can develop in order to answer Baudrillard in these contexts. And in this video I think it's really important that you kind of like are able to continue some of the like key thoughts and insights from the last video where we talked about things like the priorities, framing, and thesis context for what we'll be talking about in this one, where we get to talking more about the link, permutation, impact comparison, and alternatives specifically, all of which I think are really important facets of figuring out how you operationalize some of the more like top level stuff that seems more kind of like vague and abstract from the video that we did last. And so hopefully it'll be a good way to kind of like end out the series and give you a full idea of how this kind of like argument shows up in the resolution. I think in the context of just link debating as a whole, a lot of the responses that I think critical affirmatives should make to Baudrillard, if we're going along the lines of thinking about like how these criticisms can be generative in terms of creating tactics that are necessary at both an everyday basis but also for the ability to build maybe long-term like institutions or particular tactics that are necessary for like revolutionary action, and making arguments for instance about like why those things are able, what their interaction is between this and systems of commodification, how it relates to the idea of privatization as a whole, are really important core concepts for these critical affirmatives to address. Obviously teams will say things like commodification may be inevitable or non-unique, but I think there are more nuanced answers in terms of explaining why there's a particular value to some of the argumentation that you're making, that the particular argumentation that you're making that is outside of the kind of like particular value of whatever can be captured by these types of private actors, even if they're making arguments about how the app could be aligned with things like, for instance, Elon Musk and other forms of space privatization. You need to make arguments about why there's this inevitable excess to the way in which the affirmatives kind of methodology polarizes itself against various types of structural factors, and thus could it look the same under those means, and thus there's something like beneficial about the way in which the affirmative examples are really able to kind of like encapsulate a lot of the solvency, and thus you kind of like raise the burden for like what the other team is to have to do in their examples, whether it be making more specific examples or being able to have like a much more specific contextualization. I think that as well, that I think in addition to this, a lot of the other link arguments that I would cite that you need to really resolve is the way in which at a form level you're able to kind of like repeat some of the processes that are latent in like the problem with privatization as a whole, and the way that can open up to a reprivatization of space. And I think that in order to avoid being able to having to double turn yourself in terms of making arguments about like why it is like good that you're able to think on the basis of whatever structural criticism you're doing, or why you're forced to kind of like be able to like make a more humanistic argument about why space is available to everyone, to be able to kind of make an argument about why the kind of like weight that you should hold in the context of your structural criticism isn't to make like space some type of universal concept, but rather to open it up as something that has like multiple pluralities, and the affirmative can be an example of like what these possible pluralities look like when we think about the kind of like vision for what space looks like outside of the complete terms of like how various structures of violence have been able to kind of like form what we imagine space to be and what thus it has come out to be. I then think that with that you have a good argument for why you're able to kind of like separate yourselves from the form of kind of like sign and symbols that make it possible, that make it like harder for you to make arguments like a permutation, and thus mean that you have like more ways to create even more like nuanced examples or ways to apply various types of linked arguments that make the permutation more persuasive, while also allowing you to really have like key ground in order to generate things like external net benefits from the ones that are just latent to the affirmative solvencies. I think you can make arguments about why there's value to being able to interrogate the way in which these kind of imageries are able to perpetuate and produce various types of values that are like able to like basically coerce the public, or creating a disappearance of like how the public is actually operationalized in terms of actually having them folded into like state or the power of just kind of like civil society as a whole, and thinking about like why being able to kind of like break out of those terms in the way in which the app operationalizes them ultimately aligns itself with the alternative in a way that at least forces a different burden of competition that makes it harder for those teams to kind of win that they're actually ahead on these debates, and thus makes it a lot easier for you to be able to kind of like win if there's a lot more compatibility between the methods. I then think that when you transition what some of this kind of final advice looks like in terms of things like impact comparison, I think a lot of the arguments that you really want to make is first being able to separate your impact comparison from the type of victimization arguments that they want to make about them. I think making arguments about why there has to be a way for us to build grammar for like being able to speak through and talk about violence, even if it's impossible to create one that's whole and complete, is really important for your arguments to talk about like why there is kind of like a necessity of what those things do, maybe intramurally or in the context of various types of like communities that are contextualized by the violence that you're talking about, and being able to win that kind of like process of being able to communicate those things is different from one that produces victimization and the lack of being able to act as kind of like subject or agent, and being able to make arguments about like why that kind of like that is tied to kind of the latent solvency of why futurism is important and why it's able to speak through those various types of like scenes of violence in ways that are non-traditional and don't feed into those loops. And thus you can kind of make an argument about why overall, even if there are like ways in which science fiction and other sources have been sourced into these various like forces of violence, there's a difference to the form in which the 1AC is taking, whether and being able to pull out those nuances in specific lines and parts of the affirmative so that you can kind of like make those differences seen and known to the judge about what breaks them away from traditional understandings of the way in which we envelop ourselves in the future and what it means for being able to set kind of like maybe a framework for what other types of engagement in space will be, means that either A, that they have to win that there's something more generative to the alternative than like what the status quo does, and thus refusal may not always meet the line, or you can at least disprove that the idea of being able to see like failure as a never part of the affirmative doesn't actually do anything generative to move towards what the affirmative is actually doing, to break out of some of the forms that both the negative and the affirmative kind of seem as harmful, and being able to mold that common ground through the various portions of the debate that we talked about, whether it be how you're kind of framing the debate at the top level and the way that that trickles down into the conversation that we're having here. I think it's really important to kind of like think about where you kind of want to stick and make really coherent the positions that you're having in order to make it clear to the judge like why you want pressure to be applied in these places, and why there has to be a kind of like raising the threshold of the way in which the negative is kind of applying their various kind of like argumentation and like various types of like link arguments and alternatives to make them more contextual to the debate that you're having in the context that you're speaking in, and thus gives you a bit of a more of an edge in terms of how the judge is evaluating the overall kind of like specificity of the debate. Hopefully this video has been helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune into more videos that I'll be doing talking about various topics in the context of just LD, space privatization, or other things overall. And yeah, thank you as always for tuning in.